All right, so good morning. Before we get started this morning, I'd just like to remind you we have our newsletter printed and it will be sent out. The rest of them Monday, right? Everything? Okay, so be on the lookout for that in the mail. There's some on the back table if you guys want to go ahead and grab one for this morning. So last week we looked at Isaiah 49 verses 1 through 13. Remember, we were looking at those. We were talking about this passage here about it mentions a servant. It's actually a second servant song. And then we applied those verses to Christ the Messiah. Fairly easy to do, correct? All right. And as we saw, this passage here in Isaiah perfectly foreshadows Christ's mission. That would be his divine calling, his rejection, his suffering, and his ultimate elevation as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Just as that verse said would happen concerning this servant being Christ the Messiah. And of course, we use several references from the New Testament to tie that all together. And in so doing, I think we are able to confirm that he is the servant mentioned here who redeems his people Israel, and through that servant, salvation can be attained. That's what we learned last week. So, all right, so what we're going to do is we're going to pick up from last week this morning, and we're going to see if the believing remnant of Israel fulfills this role of servant mentioned in Isaiah 49. Verses 1 through 13. So we're going to start with Isaiah 49, verse 1 this morning. Listen, O isles, unto me, and hearken ye people from far. The Lord has called me from the womb, and from the bowels of my mother has he made mention of my name. Okay. Was the believing remnant of Israel chosen from birth to be God's covenant people? Can this apply to them? Let's look at Isaiah 44, verse 1 and 2. Yet now hear, O Jacob my servant, and Israel whom I have chosen. Thus saith the Lord that made thee and formed thee from the womb, which will help thee. Fear not, O Jacob my servant, for thou Jezreel, whom I have chosen. Okay, now this name Jezreel, you're familiar with that, right? Most often, well actually all the time, when you see this verse, it'll be a nickname, an affectionate name for in-time regathered Israel. Just as a rule of thumb, when you see that, that's what it means. It actually comes from the Hebrew meaning upright or straight. Okay? And the name only appears 4 times in the Bible. 3 times in the book of Deuteronomy and once here in Isaiah 44. Right? And it's always in reference to Israel. Always. So when you see that name, you'll know. And like I said, this is an affectionate name for Israel that God gives them. And it helps us, anytime you see that, it's when you see, like I said, when we're talking about corporate Israel, in-time regathered Israel in Bible prophecy, you'll see Jacob, Israel. You know those are names for Israel as a whole. Jezreel as well. Jezreel as well. It's national Israel. All right, and it's actually used here in contrast to when we'll find it in the book of Deuteronomy. If you go to Deuteronomy 32:15, we'll see it again. But Jezreel waxed fat and kicked. Thou art waxen fat, thou art grown thick, thou art covered with fatness. Then he forsook God which made him, and lightly esteemed the rock of his salvation. Rock of his salvation in the book of Deuteronomy. Interesting, isn't it? Very interesting. We're talking about Christ the Messiah as the servant, and here, rock of his salvation. Whose salvation? National Israel's. You see that? All right, and here, what's going on? Israel, Jezreel, is described as having grown complacent and rebellious despite God's blessings. It's a problem we have in the nation today, is it not? Anytime Israel, when the going gets good, Israel forgets God. They have forgotten me, saith the Lord. Over and over throughout the Bible we'll see this. But you see here in Isaiah 44, he's talking about Jezreel, right? And in contrast here, this is Jezreel has gone to rebellion, okay? But here the name is used in a positive and reassuring way. You see that? God is reminding his people of their calling to be an upright nation. That's what the word Jezreel means, to be upright or straight. And this verse here, actually in 44, this verse here is part of a larger context that is a message of comfort to Israel from God. So Israel, though previously disobedient and rebellious, is still chosen and loved by God. You see that? Reassurance there. God reminds us that he formed Jacob Israel and he will help them and that we need not fear. That's what's going on here. Now, can we find any evidence of Israel being chosen from birth, or being predestined or chosen from the womb? Can we find Israel's divine election in the New Testament? In the New Testament. We have to because of our new covenant believers out there, right? Okay. Romans 11:5. Even so, then at this present time also, there is a remnant according to the election of grace. There's that election again. Paul's talking to the believers in Rome. It's a letter he wrote them, right? And he's telling them that even now in this age, there is still a remnant of Israel that God elected because of his grace. He didn't have to. He elected us because we were the smallest, not the greatest, right? Okay, now let's look at another very important passage about Israel in the same book, Romans. Okay, we'll go to Romans 9, verse 6 and 7. Not as though the word of God had taken none effect, for they are not all Israel which are of Israel, neither because they are the seed of Abraham are they all children, but in Isaac shall thy seed be called. Now this is a verse used over and over again. You've seen this verse before? It's used in error 99% of the time by the Israel-only crowd and the spiritual Israel crowd. Okay, so it's used incorrectly. And when I say spiritual Israel crowd, what they'll do, the spiritual Israel crowd, you have to think about the replacement theology, right? We know about that with its dispensationalism. Okay, so that fixes the problem that we have in the earth. If the Jews are the chosen people and they hate Jesus, then how do we explain Christians who love Jesus, but they're not Israel, right? You see, we're left out. So the spiritual Israel is a little patch that they said, oh, well, that's okay because if you be Christ's, then you're Abraham's seed, right? So the spiritual Israel gets it all mixed up, and Israel only uses this as well. But they don't use it for themselves, though, because it doesn't seem to support their hypothesis. Okay, so what's going on here? I was explaining this to someone earlier this week, and I told them it's actually easier for me to just explain the Bible as the Bible reads than it is to try to figure out what the churches do with these verses, because I didn't grow up in a modern church, so I'm not very familiar with how it is they teach these verses, but I do understand, I've read enough of the Israel-only and the spiritual Israel arguments to know that this is used quite often and it confuses a great many people. So let's look at it very quickly, piece by piece. So it says, not as though the word of God has taken none effect. So Paul's addressing something here. There's some concerns that the people in Rome have brought up, right? Apparently, some of the believers, if you read the chapter, some of the believers in Rome thought that if Israel as a nation rejected Christ, then God's promises to Israel had failed or were at least rendered null and void, right? So there's a problem here. All right, then they say, for they are not all Israel which are of Israel. Okay? Paul introduces the idea then that there are two Israels in this verse. You see that? And that's not a problem. There can be two Israels. All right? But that's been taught different ways. So God's promises are still intact, but they apply to a specific group within Israel. That's how the Bible reads. That's what the Bible teaches, okay? So we have two Israels then. Ethnic Israel, or all the physical descendants of Jacob, right? Ethnic Israel. And then, of course, we have the believing remnant of Israel, who are joined to God through their faith in the covenant, right? So there's the two Israels. That's it. So simply being born an Israelite is no guarantee of what? Well, to be an heir of the promise, right? So just simply being an Israelite, is that enough? Is that what saves you? No. You understand why this isn't popular preaching within the kingdom ministry, right? Okay. But the reason we understand that simply being an Israelite isn't enough, because Paul is expanding this concept by mentioning Abraham. That's what does it in this verse. You understand? So the descendants of Abraham, when it comes to the descendants of Abraham, only Isaac was chosen. Not Ishmael or anyone else. Right? Okay, so being a biological descendant of Jacob or Abraham does not automatically mean that you inherit God's promises, does it? No. God chose Isaac over Ishmael, so the promise was not based on physical lineage alone, but on God's sovereign choice. You see, God's sovereign choice, and that's what we're talking about in Isaiah 49. That God elected. He chose somebody before they were even born. Right? All right. And you understand, if we go all the way back through these things, and we say, is there evil in God? God forbid. He chose one of the lads before they were even born, right? Jacob have I loved, Esau have I hated. Now that's New Testament theology. Of course, that harkens back to an Old Testament verse, so it's all there. So you see, being an Israelite, born of Israel, does not automatically make you an heir to the promise. America's promise does not teach race over grace. We have never taught that. Okay, actually, I have a book here from the late Pastor Barley, Israel, spiritual or physical, right? And that's where we're at with this verse. It's been taught both ways. I'll read you what he says. He says some things about the law, which of course I agree with. He says, the law cannot save you. Truly the law was Israel's schoolmaster, for the law convicts of sin and condemns for sin, but the law cannot save from sin. The God-given purpose of the law was to instruct the lost sheep of the house of Israel in the ways of righteousness, that they might know and live according to God's divine purposes. Israel's courtship with divine law also taught them that they needed divine salvation. Thus the law was Israel's schoolmaster to bring us unto Christ. This is what Pastor Barley wrote before my time. Okay? Race does not save. Race or ancestry does not save, but when the scriptures say many are called, but few are chosen, you see, many are called, few are in the remnant, right? Many are called, but few are chosen. Israel was called, and as Jesus said, I am not sent but unto the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So that's what Pastor Barley understands. That's what America's Promise is always taught. Neither the Bible nor Paul teach race over grace, or the other extreme, a universal spiritual Israel, which really gets messy with the dispensationalism, especially when you read the Schofield notes. And of course, I would suggest reading this in its entirety, because it really helps to separate the two Israels that Paul's mentioning are indeed there, biblically. They are. You've got the entire family of Israel, but then within that family, there's this elect, chosen remnant of faithful believers, faithful to the covenant. That makes them heirs to the promise. Now, if you want to study up more on Romans 9, Romans 11, right here, get this study by Pastor Richard Kirsch. All right, a study of Romans 11. The mystery of Israel, the elect, and the rest. Does a wonderful job of straightening out these verses, and I will admit, Romans 9, 10, and 11 do get confusing because there's a lot of things going on, and Paul employs a lot of legal lawyer language in it. Even if you go to a different translation like the ESV, it doesn't really help straighten out the concepts unless you know physical Israel, the remnant, and the rest of the world. That's the three concepts tied in, okay? So God's promises are fulfilled through faith, not just ethnicity. Okay? Paul here is saying that true Israel is made up of Israelites who believe in Christ. They are the children of promise. And of course, Paul mentions them again in Galatians chapter 3. You always see that verse brought up next to this one. I think it's Galatians 3:6, if you want to check that. But Paul understood these things. If you understand what Paul's talking about here, he doesn't change his mind later. Okay, there's some churches that believe he does. He doesn't. Paul's stating that there's two Israels. And he's stating within that Israel, there's a remnant believer. That's the true Israel, okay? So God's word has not failed. Though many Israelites reject God, God's plan continues through the believing remnant of Israel. That's what we're taking away from here, okay? Isaiah 49:1 is where we were. So bring this all together. It was by God's sovereign choice and his faithfulness to his people that Israel was chosen, and God continues to work through his chosen people. The churches don't teach that because they think the chosen people are who? Anybody but us. Most often it's the Jews. You've got black Hebrews now. All right? The servant in this passage could be Israel, as we've seen, as they were elected from birth to be God's covenant people, were they not? Israel. Okay. Even though Israel as a whole was chosen, only the faithful remnant remains true to God's calling. That's what Paul was explaining in his letter to the Romans. Here's another verse that serves as a witness to this. Isaiah 1:9. Except the Lord of hosts had left unto us a very small remnant, we should have been as Sodom, and we should have been like unto Gomorrah. Divine election because of God's grace, right? In later verses, you'll understand that it was Israel that would become a shame to the heathen because of their conduct, right? And God had every right to destroy all of us, but he didn't, right? Even Moses went in as an intercessor for us, remember? It's like, Moses, I'll just wipe them all out. You and me will start again. Moses is like, no. You made a covenant to them. Remember? Okay. And one last verse concerning this remnant and their election. Malachi 3:16 through 18. Then they that feared the Lord spoke often one to another, and the Lord hearkened and heard it. And a book of remembrance was written before him for them that feared the Lord, and that thought upon his name. And they shall be mine, saith the Lord of hosts, in that day when I make up my jewels, and I will spare them as a man spareth his own son that serveth him. Then shall ye return and discern between the righteous and the wicked, between him that serveth God and him that serveth him not. Speaking of the role of the believing remnant of Israel. And there's a lot going on here. In that day, so we understand the time element here is in time prophecy. In that day maketh up my jewels and spare them. You should be thinking about that wheat being gathered into the barn, right? That's what he's talking about there. And then shall you return and discern between the righteous and the wicked. Israel will decide court cases at the end of the age as overcomers in the kingdom. Is that correct? Between who? Those who serve God and those who do not. It's a little composite of in time regathered Israel's role in the end of the age, you see. So there it is again, the divine election of Israel, the remnant, the believing remnant of Israel, and their job at the end of the age. Okay? So the faithful remnant is what? Well, according to this verse, their names are recorded in the book of life. You'll find that again in Revelation. That's where it mentions the overcomers. And they're spared from God's judgment. You see, that would be end of the age judgment. That doesn't mean they're not going to have tribulations or trials in their own lives. Right? Okay. So far we've seen the remnant's divine calling was from the womb. Can we agree with that? Okay. All right. Isaiah 49 verse 2. And he hath made my mouth like a sharp sword, in the shadow of his hand hath he hid me, and made me a polished shaft, in his quiver hath he hid me. Can this be applied to in time regathered Israel, the remnant? Does the remnant act as God's prophetic voice, speaking his word faithfully? Is the word a sharp sword? Yep. Zechariah. Sorry, I lost my notes. The place of my notes here. So is this found in the remnant of Israel then? We'll go to Psalm 149, verse 6. Let the high praises of God be in their mouth. Who? Israel. And a two-edged sword in their hand. That helps, doesn't it? Okay, it's Israel. Zechariah 8, verse 13. And it shall come to pass that as ye were a curse among the heathen, O house of Judah and house of Israel, so will I save you, and you shall be a blessing. Right? Okay. A blessing how? Spreading the kingdom gospel, of course. Right? Okay. So, according to Isaiah 49:2, is the remnant hidden? Is it a mystery? Right? Are they preserved and hidden until the appointed time? Okay. Isaiah 10, verse 20 and 21. And it shall come to pass in that day that the remnant of Israel and such as are escaped of the house of Jacob shall no more again stay upon him that smote them, but shall stay upon the Lord, the Holy One of Israel, in truth. This is happening in this age, right? Okay, not stay again him that smote them, their enemies. They'll come out of Babylon, won't they? They'll have a new mode of thinking. They'll serve the king, right? Of course, here, and such as are the escaped of the house of Jacob. What's that mean to us? That's a specific remnant, a small portion, once again. The remnant of Israel. Okay. So, what about the New Testament? Do we have any evidence of Israel having the word in the church age, if you will? We'll go back to Romans 11, verse 25 and 26. For I would not, brethren, that ye should be ignorant of this mystery. What mystery? That Israelites are still on the earth, and God's still working through them. Lest you should be wise in your own conceits, that blindness in part has happened to Israel. So this is supposed to happen until when? Till the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. Okay? And so all Israel shall be saved, as is written, there shall come out of Zion the deliverer, and shall turn away ungodliness from Jacob. This is God's plan in the end of the earth. Right? Okay. From Paul's day all the way up to today, is the remnant of Israel still a mystery? For the most part, to the entire world, right? Is it a mystery to our own people? Because of the blindness of in part, right? Until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. So apparently one day, and if you read enough end time prophecy, you'll understand this. One day all of Israel will know who they are. One day. It's not going to happen all at once. It's not going to happen in this age. It's going to take God to do that. It's going to take God's messengers to do this. Of course, the tares and the wheat, once again. It was only done with divine intervention to begin with, right? So one day, this blindness in part will be removed by God because he's the one that saw to it. Okay? So, the mystery will subside when God's plan is revealed worldwide. You see, one day, all of Israel will know who they are. Isaiah 49:3, and said unto me, Thou art my servant, O Israel, in whom I will be glorified. And like we said last week, we understand that it does seem to identify the servant in this passage as Israel. By the time you get to verses 5 and 6, Israel is distinct from the nation. The servant is distinct from the nation. Okay? And now that we've seen what Paul's written about them, that is distinct from national Israel. So is the remnant distinct from national Israel? Yes, because the remnant don't have the blindness in part the rest of the Israel nation does, right? Okay, that's why they're distinct. So have we seen already, the believing remnant then in Israel represents true Israel. Okay, that's why we have two Israels from Romans 9. All right, Romans 9:27. Isaiah also crieth concerning Israel, though the number of the children of Israel be as the sand of the sea, a remnant shall be saved. You see there again, another concept that we do have two Israels. We have national Israel, who are numbered as the sand of the sea. It's going back to the Abrahamic covenant, is it not? Okay. But within this nation, there's a remnant who shall be saved. A remnant who shall be saved. All right? Like I said, do a study on Romans 11, because it'll really, really help. So God is glorified in the faithful remnant who, according to Paul in Galatians 6, are of the household of faith. Okay? That's the remnant. They're of the household of faith. Those faithful ones are called the Israel of God. Okay? And that's where the spiritual Israel crowd gets it wrong. You see? They'll say, well, if you're faithful to God, you're Israel. Well, not necessarily. An Israelite who's faithful to God is an Israelite, okay? Someone who's non-Israelite, faithful to God, is a Christian. That's fine. That happens. But we're talking within the family of Israel, there's a remnant who shall be saved. Paul says they're of the household of faith. The remnant who is of the household of faith are the Israel of God. They're the Israel of God. They're the heirs to the promise. Okay? And just like Paul wrote earlier in Romans, even so to this day there is a remnant. Right? Okay. You see, it's easier to just teach the Bible as how it reads, right? I think so. All right, so the remnant of Israel who are faithful to the covenants are the Israel of God. Okay? And by extension, by necessity, they are children of Abraham. Right? Okay. Ezekiel 36, verse 22 and 23. Therefore say unto the house of Israel, thus saith the Lord God, I do not this for your sakes, O house of Israel, but for mine holy name's sake, which ye have profaned among the heathen, whither ye went, and I will sanctify my name, which was profaned among the heathen, which ye have profaned in the midst of them, and the heathen shall know that I am the Lord, saith the Lord God, when I shall be sanctified in you before their eyes. There's the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. You see, this would be the revelation of end-time Israel to everyone in the earth. You see? That's what ties together. Isaiah 49 said, God will glorify his name through Israel's restoration. Okay? That's exactly what Ezekiel's talking about here. Isaiah 49:4. Then I said, I have labored in vain, I have spent my strength for naught, and in vain, yet surely my judgment is with the Lord, and my work with my God. Does the remnant of Israel suffer from a belief in the mission's apparent failure? Does the remnant of Israel believe that today? That our mission isn't going so well, that it's all for naught. We're laboring in vain. Yet does our Bible speak about the mission's success in the eyes of the world? Does it do that over and over? We're not going to go through all of them today, but you go back to Isaiah 2, Isaiah 51, Micah 4, most of Joel, Hosea 2. Zechariah does a good job too. Even though the remnant of Israel who express that their labor is in vain, that the mission has failed, that it is failing, does the Bible say otherwise? That in the end of the age, the entire world will know who Israel is and they will glorify God for that? Does the Bible say anything about every tongue confessing and every knee bowing to God? Yes. So is Israel's mission a failure? No. Is it still being done in the earth in this age? Yes. Okay, yes. And there are more than a few verses verifying all of this, so we're not going to take the time to look at them today, okay? Isaiah 49:6. And he said, it is a light thing that thou shouldest be my servant to rise up the tribes of Jacob and to restore the preserved of Israel. I will also give thee for a light to the Gentiles, that thou mayest be salvation unto the ends of the earth. We've read in Acts, Paul and Barnabas quoting this, right? Paul and Barnabas being part of the believing remnant of Israel, right? Tying this mission of theirs into this prophecy concerning Israel. So once again, Paul and Barnabas quote this verse directly in Acts, which effectively ties their mission as the end-time remnant of Israel, bringing salvation to the nations. The good news of the gospel, you see. So yes, that is the job of end-time Israel. Even though at times it feels like it's not doing so well. The mission isn't going forward as quickly as we think, but it's all going according to plan. If the king's got a plan, right? All right. So is a part of the remnant's mission then to be a light to the nations? Yes. And as we've discussed previously in the sermons from last month, the word Gentiles is goy, meaning people or nations. So once again, the biblical order of the Great Commission is implicated. Okay? The remnant is to take the gospel of the kingdom to the scattered nations of Israel, correct? Okay. And tell them of Christ's good news and the work he's done for them. That's the gospel of the kingdom. Then after Israel is instructed, the other nations are to be taught the same thing, right? Okay, the good news of the gospel of the kingdom. And of course, we've seen this over and over and over again. So Pastor Reed is saying, yes, Israel will be a light to the nations. We don't have to get stuck on this word nations like the other guys do. There'll be a light to the Israel nations. There'll be a light to the nations of the earth. Is that all right? Does that work out? Yes. Okay. I'm not taking any special liberties here with end-time prophecy, am I? Does this allow for a dual fulfillment of whatever this word means? Israel will take the good news of the gospel of the kingdom to their own people, the scattered nations of Israel who are sifted among the earth, right? Okay. And when Israel is instructed and equipped to take that message, it'll be brought to the other nations. Right? What? The good news of salvation. Not if you are anything but an Israelite, you get the redemption covenant. Right? That's where everybody gets it mixed up. Redemption and salvation are not the same terms. They are not. Israelites are to take the good news of the gospel of the kingdom and the redemption Christ has provided for that national Israel to the nations of Israel. The good news of the gospel of salvation goes all over the earth. All right? So, how does the remnant fit into the role of the servant as described in Isaiah 49? Here's some attributes we've read about. The remnant of Israel, as the servant, is to remain faithful to God's covenant. Is that correct? Do we still have a believing remnant that does that to this day? All right. Do we act as God's prophetic voice in the earth as the servant? All right. Proclaiming God's salvation to the nations. Yes. Nations of Israel, everywhere else, doesn't matter. That's what we've seen doing. Ultimately, will the remnant be restored and God glorified? Yes, in the sight of the nations. As a matter of fact, end-time prophecy says this will happen in the sight of kings and princes. They'll all see this, okay? Not for the glory of Israel, for the glory of God. For the glory of God. Now, remember, if this servant is Christ, and the servant is the remnant of Israel, then Christ's fulfillment of the servant role here is primary. It's primary, and that's how we keep this straight. But the believing remnants is secondary, but it still serves a purpose in the earth until the return of the king, correct? Yes, that's how those are dual fulfillments. Christ's servant role is primary, and Israel is to follow up with that and continue and expand on that mission. So what I'm saying is, through the believing remnant of Israel, God's plan still continues. Okay? It didn't all come to a stop. Okay, that's another eschatology. We've got all prophecy stopped. Yeah. No. Paul told us that the remnant's still with us to this day. Pastor Reed's saying that's right. The servant's mission as end-time regathered Israel is still continuing to this day. Until when? Well, till the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. What's that? Well, Paul calls it a mystery. No man knows when that'll happen. So, we'll close today's sermon by looking at a few key things that we looked at this week and last week, and we'll combine those. In Isaiah 49, we are presented with a servant figure. Okay, remember they were chosen before birth and tasked with restoring Israel and bringing light to the nations. So from verse 1, we saw that the servant is called or chosen from the womb and set apart for God's mission. The servant is also called Israel, but we've seen that they're distinct from the nation as a whole as they represent a faithful portion. And through them, God is glorified. You see how that works? Okay. Now, would Christ represent a faithful portion of national Israel? Yes. You see how that works? Of course he does. All right. The servant is also seen expressing their labor as vain, right? Or yet, despite their apparent failure, God upholds that servant, and ultimately, God's purposes are realized through this servant. And of course, that purpose is what? The redemption and restoration of national Israel and salvation to the ends of the earth, right? Okay. We also see that God's compassion is seen in the servant. His work is what? Setting free captives, providing for the needy, and guiding people to God in his word. Is that something that Christ did, and is that something that the remnant of Israel does? Yes. So the servant upholds the covenant and is a witness to the truth, right? And through this faithfulness, they're a light to others. Is that God? Is that Christ? Yes. Is that the remnant of Israel? Yes. So if this is a dual fulfillment, then we can see that God's purposes never fail. You see, that's the importance of understanding these as dual fulfillment in prophecy. Christ is the true fulfillment of national Israel's calling. He was the embodiment of mission success. Okay? We are the remnant, and we are to continue Christ's mission to be a light to the world through our faithfulness, right? Because we're part of the household of faith. We are the Israel of God. Of course, how do you identify the Israel of God? Jesus told us a surefire way. By their fruits, you'll know them, right? So we, as the remnant of Christ, are to continue Christ's mission. And next week, we'll look at Isaiah 50. And then we'll look at the role of Christ the Messiah and the role of in-time regathered Israel in the light of Isaiah 50's prophecies. And as you go along in Isaiah 50, 51, 52, 53, through the servant songs and servant roles, it does get more difficult to try to pin down in-time Israel's job in the servant roles as we go along, because some of them are talking about his hands being pierced and things like that. It's very obviously Christ. Applying those to in-time regathered Israel is a bit more difficult, but it can be done. We'll do that, all right? So until then, reflect on what your role is as the remnant of Israel, as God's chosen covenant people. And of course, that means that we're called to be light to a dark world. We're called to walk in obedience. And of course, we're to trust that our labor in the Lord is never in vain. That's all we have for today.